Hello everyone, Christina Werner here. Welcome to another video for assignmentstamp.com. Today I'm going to be taking it back to basics with alcohol markers and do very simple coloring with the Hocus Pocus stamp set. This came out in the Stamptember release, so it's perfect for Halloween or just any magic themed cards you want to create. I'm starting out by stamping the images that I'll be coloring in an alcohol marker friendly ink. So the SSS Stamp Intense Black ink is a great ink for this. It's not going to smear or smudge when you use alcohol inks right over the stamping. Now, because I am stamping these images a couple of times to make sure I get a solid line, I will probably want to let this sit for a few minutes to let that ink dry completely. If the ink is not completely dry, you could get some bleeding or smudging when you start coloring. So I let this sit aside for a little bit and dry for a while. You could also use a heat tool just to speed up the drying process. But once it's completely dry, you won't have any problem coloring right over the top with your Copics or Olo markers or whatever alcohol markers you choose to color with. So I'm going to be doing a very simple coloring technique where I am putting down one layer of color over all of the images. I'm not adding any shading or any kind of three-dimensional, anything like that. We just want solid color for each one of these areas. And the idea behind this is we're going to keep it very simple, and we're going to add the shadows with one marker, all the same color. Well, we are going to swap it out for a little bit of a different shade too for a couple areas, but for most all of the areas on these images, all of the shadows and shading will be added using just one color of marker. It's a really great way to stretch the use of your markers, or if you are just starting out your collection and you don't have very many colors, this is a great way to get that more shaded look, but without the need of so many different colors in your stash. So I'm going through and adding these colors over each one of these areas. For the two girls, I decided to have one have a little bit of a darker skin tone with kind of like a medium brown hair. And then the other one is going to be more pale and have a bright red hair or more of a coppery ginger hair. I thought it would just look really fun with her orange and black dress. So I've got two different kind of skin tones happening, but we're going to use the same shadow for both. So this is going to be a really great way to show how you can use the same colors for all of your shading. So I've got almost all of those images colored in with their basic color. So now I'm going to add the shadows. I'm using the color BV02, and the idea behind this is that shadow in real life has a little bit of a purple tinge to it, just because it's a very cool tone. Think of shadows as being very cool to the touch. It's not warm, it's not hot. They're very cool in comparison. So having like a purpley gray is great for adding shadow. So I'm adding shadow over all of the different areas on these images, just using that same BV02 shade. And because this is a much lighter gray, it's going to let the color that's already been colored underneath kind of show through. So it takes on the color of whatever beneath it, and it lends itself to this technique where you're adding a shadow after the fact. Now, there were a couple different colors here that this BV02 just wasn't quite enough to really show the shading. You can really see that over these dark gray or almost black areas that the shadow sort of gets lost. So I'm actually going to swap out this BV02 for a slightly darker shade here in a little bit. And I'll be intensifying some of those shadows just so that they show up a little bit better. I forgot to add the blush to their cheeks. So I added a little bit of pink on there for their cheeks and also the pink on the cat. And then I came in and added just an N2 gray just to fill in some of those spots, and an N4 to add some stripes to the little cat. All right, so I'm adding more pink onto the cat. And then this is about when I realized I needed to add a few other shadows and colors in just to really intensify things. So I swapped that BV02 for a BV04, and it's going to give it an even darker purple shadow, but I think it lends itself to the darker gray on these images, just to have a little bit more of that darker shading for these areas. So I'm also going to grab a brown for the wand, and also to add some detail on their clothing, I thought it'd be fun to bring in kind of a little darker of an oranger shade. I believe I used the same color that I used for her hair, and I added some polka dots on the skirt of her dress. I'm also going to add those polka dots on the ribbon on her hat as stripes instead of dots this time. And then for the other girl's dress, I thought it'd be fun to bring in a darker purple shade and just add some like texture, almost like a pinstripe to the main area of her dress right in the center. And I made sure those stripes kind of flowed with the shape of her dress as well. This just gives the illusion of some texture. So after all the images were colored, I used the coordinating dies to cut them all out. Now, if you don't have the dies for this set, it's a little bit of a larger set. It can be expensive. These are super easy images to cut out just with some fussy cutting as well. But I had the dies on hand, so I decided to use those and just ran that through my die cutting machine so I could cut out all of these images and then assemble them later on my card. So I popped them all out and they look absolutely perfect once they're all trimmed out. They look really great. I'm going to set these aside while I work on a background for something to go behind these images. I'm using the Circle Illusion 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders and some black cardstock from SSS Stamp. I spritzed that cardstock pretty liberally on both sides and then ran that through my die cutting machine so I could emboss all of that. The paper was still wet, so I used my heat tool just to speed along the drying. And then I brought in some paper glaze in this nice purple shade from Picket Fence Studios. And I'm going to apply this right over the top of that black textured cardstock. And it's going to emphasize that texture and give it a kind of a spooky vibe with purple and black. I did a similar background last year around this time. I think it was for a Thanksgiving card. And with that one, I used purple cardstock and brought in a black paste. And it was a different colored paste, and it sort of emphasized the texture. But you can get a similar look by using black cardstock and putting a more opaque paste right over the top. I think it looks really great. You get kind of a very grungy sort of look when you apply it this way. I'm using a mini round blending tool. This is the flat foam, not the domed. We want it flat so that it's not going to go down into the center of those textured areas on accident. We want it to be very flat as it's applied. And I'm just rubbing that onto my project. Now, you're not going to be able to wash the paste out of the mini foam pad. It is sacrificed to the crafting gods when you do this, but I have so many of those like flat pads left over from in my ink blending years because I used to blend with the flat ones, but now I use the domed ones for ink blending. So these flat ones aren't getting much use. So this is a great way to use those. For the greeting, I stamped it onto some black cardstock, the same black cardstock I used for my background. I used an anti-static powder tool to prep that before I stamped it in white pigment ink, and then applied some alabaster embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. After that was heat set and melted and cooled off, I used a microfiber cloth to wipe away any of that excess anti-static powder tool. It's a great way to clean that up, and you can see how it wipes away all that extra powder, which allows me to then die cut my greeting that's going to go on the front of my card. I ran that through my die cutting machine, and then I have the perfect cut out greeting to go right below all of those images that I've colored and trimmed out. I adhered my background, the textured background, to a prepared card base. This is an A2 card. So I'm going to put this right on top, and because that embossed cardstock, it can shrink just a little bit when it's embossed. So I had some white cardstock peeking out on the sides. So I did take a ruler and a craft knife just to trim that up and get it so it's just perfect. I then adhered all of my images using some foam adhesive, including some foam adhesive behind that greeting. And the card's almost done, but I just can't help myself. I had to add a little bit of sparkle and glitter. So I used some Stickles glitter glue, and instead of applying it directly to my project, I squeezed that out onto some scratch paper. And then I used a very inexpensive brush. It's actually been dedicated for this purpose in my craft room. And I used that brush to pick up the glitter glue and just kind of pounce on a little bit of that glitter over different areas on my card. This is going to make sure that I don't have a super thick concentration of the glitter glue, which could obscure the areas of the imagery below. I wanted it to just be a slight glisten of glitter. I didn't want it to be too overwhelming. So applying it with a brush like this It gives me a little bit more control over where that glitter is applied. So here's the finished card for today using that Hocus Pocus stamp set and dies from SSS Stamp. Make sure you check out all of the supplies that are listed down below in the video description and also in the supplies over at the Simon blog, so you can go over and do a little bit of shopping. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll be back very soon with another video. Thanks for watching.